friends, if you would please pray with me. God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. You are our strength and our rock. Amen. So friends, imagine that about 1,000 years from now, or even 2,000 years from now, that people are reading the newspapers from May 4th, 2025. Imagine perhaps they're intercepting the ways that we communicate with each other. Letters, emails, text messages. There would be a lot that would not make much sense. Looking at the newspapers today, they would read about tariffs, about deep division, constitutional crisis, Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, and so forth, and they would be a little bit lost as to what it all meant. Well, it's the same for us when we approach the early church text. 2,000 years ago, as the church was first forming, they are having insider talk, and we don't really know what's going on. And specifically in the passage today, that is about the Hellenists and the Romans, and it matters, so bear with me here when we get to the point. It does matter. The Hellenists are Greek-speaking Jews, as opposed to the Hebrew or Aramaic-speaking Jews. So Hellenist, Greek-speaking Jews, Hebrew, Aramaic-speaking Jews. When Acts was written, there were hundreds of Hellenistic Jewish communities throughout the Roman Empire, and there was tension between the Hebrew Jews and the Hellenistic or Greek-speaking Jews in the early church. And let us remember that this early church still identified as Jewish. So Stephen, who you heard about earlier, was part of the Hellenistic Jewish community. The issue that this passage opens with is that the Hellenistic widows were being neglected. They weren't getting the food that they needed, as opposed to the Hebrew Jews. Now, taking care of widows, orphans, and anyone who did not have a way to support themselves in this culture, including foreigners, was completely central to Judaism and to the early church. So we have the 12 apostles, and they were traveling and preaching and healing and doing their thing, and in truth, they were really too busy to do this other kind of ministry, this kind of care ministry of feeding and caring for the poor. So they decided to appoint the first diaconate, or what today we call deacons. And these folks were specifically chosen for care ministries, to serve the poor, to care for the needy, to minister right there among those who were with them. So the apostles asked God to help them discern who among them had these gifts, and thus the first board of deacons was chosen. Now in time, Stephen, one of the deacons, had a lot to say, as you heard, to the Hebrew Jews among them. And he launched into a very long speech. It was pretty rambly and not always accurate, but he generally lambasted them for the times that their ancestors hardened their hearts to what God asked of them. He accused them of doing the same, saying that they had calluses on their hearts and flaps on their ears. They get really mad, and they stone him. Now, this is not necessarily the best advertisement to join the deacons committee. Our engagement team is probably prefer I not tell this story of one of the first deacons of the church coming to such a difficult and troublesome end. But here we are. One of the first deacons of the early church was the first reported martyr, killed by differences of understanding among people of the same faith. So here's the deal. Here's the truth, is that watershed moments in the history of the church have to do almost always with how we either broaden our circles or how we contract and try to shrink them. It almost always comes down to how we handle differences, and specifically how we either are or are not open to increasing our diversity. Anytime we narrow the door, a crisis happens until we can find ways to broaden it again. The crisis may take 500 years, but it comes. And crises, of course, always bring with them opportunity. And let us not forget, our story today, everything that is happening in the very first Easter tide, right after the very first Easter. And let us also not forget that the world-changing event of the resurrection colored everything that the early church did. Everything. If God could raise Jesus from the dead, then literally everything was different. And who were they to say who wasn't included in that kind of love? And yes, sometimes it did cost them their lives. And the movement as a whole would only grow, not just in numbers, but in breadth and understanding of the power of God's love and grace. This is what one of my former professors, Catherine Shaner, calls resurrection ethics. Resurrection ethics. Living in a way that prioritizes grace and justice, knowing that eventually, some way, God's Phoenix Spirit will transform everything for the good of all. So it's resurrection ethics that we see here when the Hellenistic widows are finally being taken care of too. We see resurrection ethics through the spiritual aliveness that we witness in Stephen and his boldness in speaking to the bigger thing that God was doing here. And we see resurrection ethics as well when he asked for their forgiveness, just like Jesus. In fact, the story is very much modeled on the story of Jesus' crucifixion, as you probably saw. And he had the vision that the church would go on despite the narrow-mindedness, despite the false accusations, despite the cruelty. And even the ones who are part of being the cruel ones would still be in, and they would still be loved. And finally, we see resurrection ethics foreshadowed in the 180-degree change that happened in Saul when he became Paul and said yes to what God was doing, yes to God's ways being bigger than his own limits. So friends, again, we find ourselves at a crossroads of how the church is now, of how the church is either not accepting of ever-increasing diversity or it is. And now, like many times in the past, these issues have conflated with the powers of the day, emperors, kings, rulers, or presidencies. And it can feel like, in the midst of oppressive and overpowering Christian nationalism, that maybe we're at the end. Maybe we're at the end. Maybe this 2,000-year movement is in its swan song chapter. But, we look back. We can look back and see how the Spirit of God is always up to something, even if we can't see it, and even if we won't see it in our lifetime. We look back and we see that it remains no matter what. We cannot change everything, but we can do our part, which is always living in Eastertide and leaning into resurrection ethics now, being bold and forgiving, advocating still for the widows of our day, which is anyone who has no legal protections now or those who in fact are being stripped of legal protections, and there are too many to name, and you know them. We lean into resurrection ethics when we stick it out together despite smaller differences, because something bigger than any of us is afoot and is looking to take root and to grow. Something is looking to be born, to come alive in ways that we don't yet know, but that we can feel the birth pangs of. We feel the contractions making way for what God is doing now. And our part is quite simply and profoundly to stay faithful, to take the long view, the view of the eagle instead of the ant, without ever giving up what really matters, staying lovingly grounded, believing that indeed, with God, all things are possible. The poem that is in your bulletin for the moment for reflection was really the best way that I could end this sermon. So if you would bear with me while I read it to you, and I encourage you to take it with you. It is written for this moment. This is the main event by Joshua Luke Smith. Loss and longing, they're constants here in the Shadowlands. What we fear most may happen. So how then shall we live? We must stain God's shirt with tears and announce how difficult it can feel to be here, but that we are still here. We must cut loose from self-sufficiency and trust fall into grace. We must protect ourselves from bitterness and a cynical heart, and so we must keep forgiving. We must trade in our armor for open arms raised in surrender and praise and a welcoming embrace. We must hold ourselves captive in the high castle of hope, blinded by wonder, bound by joy, winded in reverence. We must put ourselves in the way of all in binge-worthy box sets. We must not define our lives by our worst days, and neither should we by our best. Most of life is in the middle. We must enjoy each meal for the feast it is and raise our glasses, making extravagant toast on very ordinary days. Though the ache remains, we keep loving. The alternative is no alternative at all. We keep living, one day at a time, one day at a time, one day at a time. Amen.